Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 418 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. This week, we continue our series More Than a Maker with an interview featuring Bakersville, North Carolina artist Will Baker. He's known for his beautiful atmospheric fired pottery, along with his kiln building skills, which have taken him all over the U.S. In our interview, we talk about dealing with burnout, as well as the theory behind flow states. To see examples of his work, you can visit his website. That's williambakerpottery.com. Also wanted to mention another interview where we did a deep dive into flow states and the research of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and that was Paul Briggs and I talking in 2019 on episode 278. That is available on major podcast apps, so if you scroll back in the feed, you'll be able to check that out. So without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So I wanted to start talking about, well, we should say for the listener, we've done an in-depth bio interview with you years ago. That was probably, I don't even know how long ago that was, probably 7 years. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, I think it was 5 years.
Yeah. And we've kept in touch on and off and have known each other for a long time. But when we started talking again, probably about a year or so ago, the conversation went towards flow and mindfulness and meditation because you had developed some issues with adrenal fatigue. Can you talk about how you led up to a path where you realized hey, I got to actually practice mindfulness to help what's going on with my brain?
Yeah, so that was kind of a slow process for me. But then, once it hits you pretty hard. So over the last 2-3 years, like everyone, it's been rough. There's been a lot of challenges. But what happened for me was right after the pandemic hit in 2020, I found myself, I wasn't aware of it at first, but slowly became aware of really increased tension and anxiety and stress. Of course, it had to do with the new reality of the world, but just all of a sudden, everything was a lot heavier. Every little thing, financial worries, the life of being a potter, self-employed, it just kind of went on and on. The news. A few months later, the summer of 2020, my mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer quite out of the blue. So that obviously piled on a whole new level. And it was shortly after that as this sort of stress and just daily life got worse for me, luckily for me, my wife and I were able to recognize it, and we stopped and said, this is not normal. This is not you. Let's figure this out. And so we sought some help from a woman near us who I believe would be classified as like a naturopathic specialist. I just started talking to her, and within literally 5 minutes of telling her my symptoms and her asking me some questions, she basically said, yeah, this sounds like adrenal fatigue. And I had no idea what that was, but as it turns out, it basically meant all of your stress hormones in your body are out of whack, and your system for regulating those stress hormones has broken down. And the way I came to understand it was basically your body goes from fight or flight in a split second, right? So you're already operating at 90, and anytime any kind of stress comes in, you just fly right above 100. And your body never really resets itself, back down to whatever level is equilibrium, whether it's 50 or 0, right? So right away by talking to her, I realized, yes, this is, I wake up in the morning and within 5 minutes, I can't handle anything, you know? And at that time we had two small kids and, just getting up and trying to get to the kitchen and I'm breaking down. And this has happened repeatedly, And so, once I had sort of a quote diagnosis, and then I had some awareness of it and understanding of it, and then some natural supplements that helped regulate my cortisol and all the other ones, right? And this was done through blood work. She then had me do some really serious blood work, and she could identify, oh yeah, look right here, your cortisol level is out of whack completely, and so is your dopamine, your serotonin, your right. So all of a sudden, it became completely obvious that the whole system was out of whack. Unfortunately, my mom was still battling cancer for the next few months, and she ended up passing away in late January of 2021. And so, even though I had some understanding and started to get a little bit more stability, the waves kept coming, for me in my life. So it still took several more months of continuing with these supplements. And, during that time also, the same specialist and some other folks in my life were, repeatedly recommending meditation and yoga as things that would really help me. And I was never against that. Meditation had always been something in my life that was just sort of circling around in the background, Since I was really young, I was aware of it as an idea, something I was attracted to, but not something I could understand or practice. My wife had been doing yoga for many years, I don't know, 8 or something years right in front of me, but it took a long time until I sort of gradually became interested, mainly as a way to stretch, just to stretch my body and to heal certain stresses here and there, which I found really interesting. But then once I came back around to it this time, I was able to sort of take the yoga to another level, especially with the daily practice of it. So all these things, adding up for me, luckily through time, I was able to regulate my, stress responses. It has definitely not been a straight line by any means. There's been some ups and downs, but let's see, fast forward to not quite where we are now, but let's say, the end of last year, things felt like they were moving in the right direction. I had a daily yoga practice and I was working on a daily meditation practice. And then back in, I guess it was February, I had another sort of really intense month of just tension and anger, and it was really affecting, obviously, not only myself, but the whole family. And that was another sort of turning point where I think I started to be able to understand, I needed some more help. I needed to talk to a counselor for a little bit, which I've only recently started. And although that's been tremendously helpful, and it's actually, I can really see how it's helping me connect a lot more dots. I also think it has been reconnecting with being able to connect the meditative side of yoga, the breath work, and then getting to the flow state, which for me has been something that it took me quite a while to realize, but it's actually been at the heart of my entire clay practice before I knew it. And now that I know it, it's tremendous.
Yeah, and we're going to talk in depth about flow, but before we get into the solution, I want to spell out the problem a little bit more for the listener. There's a physical component here, which is the adrenal fatigue, which I think a lot of people have experienced this, where you feel depleted in a way that a day off from work is not going to, kick you back to normal. And then there's the psychological component, which is beliefs about yourself, beliefs about the world, but they're separate. And I have found for myself, and I wonder if this is the similar for you, is that if your body is still on that fight or flight mode, it's very hard to work on the psychology because you're sitting in front of a counselor and it's just hard to get to a starting point. So what I've found for myself is that through daily meditation and through other modalities, if I can keep the fight or flight feeling that I have down to a normal level, then I can see a counselor or, in my case, a meditation teacher or other sort of outside help. So have you found that the physical had to be addressed first and able to do the psychological part?
Yeah, I mean, it took me a while. I still lose it sometimes. I'm still trying to gain a hold of it. But and it's like when you talk to anybody about meditation, I finally figured out is talk to an expert, a so-called expert who's been doing it for 30 years, and the first thing they'll say is, "Yeah, if I get 7 good seconds, then I'm feeling good." Like I like that. That helped me when I heard that. But for me, I guess I would encourage people just Google adrenal fatigue and then consider getting slightly off the mainstream, because my understanding is it's not an official diagnosis in the mainstream world. But all I can tell you is when this woman described it to me, literally it's just like every bell starts ringing, And so then when I started doing my own reading and research, it's like, yeah, this is clearly what's going on in my body. And then the blood work, so I was convinced of it. But I guess I would say the touchstone for me on that is when I think back to sort of my times when I would come down in the morning, and I recognize now that my body was just immediately, in fight or flight mode, right? So it didn't take anything. Literally, I walk in the kitchen, I'm already there. Within a minute or two, I'm already in tears, right? And a lot of it is physical. My body is reacting in a stress, right? My stress hormones are pulsing. Oh, and a lot of it is mental. I look over at my wife and I feel shame and guilt. All that stuff floods in. So it's completely connected, mind and body. But what helped for me was sort of my first touchstones to how meditation could help me was what I call sort of the SOS meditations, where I would just say, "I'm sorry, I need to leave right now." And I would just go walk in a different room, put on my headphones, pick out one of my SOS guided meditations, usually for like 10 minutes. And what I found pretty quickly was like, yeah, within 5 minutes, if I can just focus on this. And for me, that's what I needed, was like a guided, SOS, nice little voice in my head with some music, but it helped me just connect to my breath and helped me actually, okay, within a few minutes, I can calm myself down. I can literally calm my own body down. I realize now that I'm not just calming my body down, I'm calming my mind and my body at the same time. And literally, I can't do anything else until I do that, right? I can't even finish my conversation with you properly until I just stop and go do that, whether it takes 3 breaths or whether it takes 30 minutes. So for me, that was like how I actually first was able to even touch into meditation. And I feel fortunate now that like I rarely sort of reach for that SOS guided one, but now it's become a different, it's a different pattern. And now I know like I need to go take a walk, right now.
What's interesting to hear this experience of fight or flight early in the morning, like you wake up, theoretically we rest when we sleep, but that's also dependent on how all of our neurochemistry is going on. We can still have a pretty high level of stress during our sleep states and wake up pretty jacked. Like I've felt that before. I remember in grad school, I was getting ready for my big exhibition and I would wake up feeling like I was getting ready to run. You know what I mean? Like it was,
Yeah.
I was at such an elevated state of those stress hormones. But there's some interesting telltale signs if you're in that state and you don't know it. Because what you're describing is that you could tell, Joy, your wife, was helping you realize like, hey, your behavior and your sort of presence are different than it used to be. But what I've found is I'm often going in that direction, but I didn't have anyone around me to tell what's happening. Here were some of the signs. One, I was super irritable at very small things.
Yeah.
So think about like road rage. Like you're driving somewhere and all of a sudden you're pissed because the person, cut you off or, whatever it is. But then the day before, the exact same thing happened and I had no reaction. There was like no issue. So I started to notice there were things like that. And then I also started to notice that my actual cognitive function was impaired.
Oh, yeah.
I went to a friend of mine that had been a counselor for years, and she explained when you're in fight or flight mode, when your body is coursing with adrenaline and other things, it's very hard to do simple things like balance checkbook, because all of that fight or flight, the flight part of that scenario, evolutionarily is based on you being able to get away from a predator or some danger. So you get dumber, so to speak, when you're in those states, because your brain is simplifying. It's simplifying down to like, what can I do to protect myself in this moment?
Yeah. Well, I mean, also it's just a matter of attention, right? Like the other day I was listening to something about multitasking, right? We all thought we could multitask, and now they say, no, you only have so many bits of information that your brain can compute, right? Let's say it's 120, right? Let's say it takes 80 bits per second to have a conversation with somebody, right? And then now let's say two people are talking to you at once. So now you're maxed out. You're at 160 and you can only actually do 120, right? So are you really multitasking? Like, are you really doing those two things? Is your awareness there? Not really, So when you were saying that, I was realizing like two things. Like the trick is to actually be able to train yourself to clue into those things earlier and earlier and earlier, right? And this is coming from a counselor. This is not me. So it's like, okay, I just blew up at my kids or my wife or whatever. I just freaked out on myself. I feel bad now. Oh, wow. Look, now I'm noticing that I have a whole rush of guilty and sad emotions. Oh, wow. I'm going to back up. I'm going to start to work myself back and realize that didn't actually feel good. So over time, working yourself back to realize it's a physical and emotional thing, but you can feel this, you can feel them coming after they happen, and you can work yourself back to where you can start to feel yourself getting agitated at little things. And you can say, hold on a second, what's going on here? Before you actually blow your top at somebody who just walked in the room, really, right? So the trick is to learn to stop it way before you get to that point. And that comes from recognizing it and awareness. And a lot of that is body sensations or patterns, maybe patterns of agitation or behavior or whatever. But the other thing that I was thinking of when you were saying that was, if you're in fight or flight mode, and this is just me rambling, but let's say you're using at least 120 of your bits per second, right? You're using all of it, if not more, because you're already sort of pushing adrenaline. So anything that comes in at you at that moment, whether it be balancing a checkbook or the phone rings or somebody cuts you off, you're already gone. It doesn't take anything at that point, because you can't process it, you can't handle it, and it's going to set you off. So that was another connection I was making recently between like awareness and focus and like where you're putting that. And when you're in fight or flight mode, like you're not putting it anywhere. It's just all already streaming in one direction.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. More Than a Maker is made possible by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Montana, proud sponsors of Wellness for Makers. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Montana is focused on building healthier communities through strategic investments to improve population health, increase access to care, and to make healthcare more affordable for all. For more information, please visit bcbsmt.com. Yeah, and you had sent me a podcast by Dan Harris. It's 10% Happier with Johan Hari, and he had gone through and broken up. I think he had 12 things that can help steal our focus, and these would be sort of environmental or social causes that can lead to frustration, distraction. Ultimately, to this feeling of being overwhelmed. And one of the things you mentioned was multitasking. And for a while there, it was like cool to say, like, I can listen to a podcast, make a pie, talk to someone in the studio, or this is what I was telling myself. I could do all these things. And as you mentioned, the more research they do on that, it's what they call switching. So you're not actually doing multiple things at once. You're just switching between things quickly, very rapidly. And the problem about that is that you don't ever achieve a deep sense of focus. And as I was listening to that, I was thinking back to conversations we've had recently about flow, which is kind of the opposite of that. It's deep focus that you can initiate, or once you know it's possible, you can initiate it. So can you talk about how going from this state of realizing you needed to do something different in your life, doing some counseling, doing some meditation, how did you realize that there was a topic or a philosophy called flow? Like, when did you first get turned on to that?
Well, that's kind of a long story. Just recently, I was at the Sodapposium, and I was tasked with giving a 2-hour presentation on soda firing, right? So my other colleagues were giving a 2-hour demonstration, a clay demo, and I was tasked with giving a presentation on soda firing, which I thought was great because I didn't have to do the clay thing. And then I slowly started to realizing, how am I going to take everything I know about soda firing and present it to this group of people? And what was interesting was I just naturally, especially as time got shorter and shorter, I started writing this presentation that was a combination of transmitting everything I know about soda firing and tying it together with how I think about moving heat and draft through a kiln, how fire flows through a chamber, how water flows through a river. And immediately I'm picturing myself standing in front of this group of people holding up the flow book saying, I need to tell people to read this book. And it's ironic because I've actually never read the book, which I'm telling you now. I don't know if I ever told you that, but so this was just a few weeks ago, but I guess the touchstone for me probably goes back more like 3 years when I was heading for a workshop. It was at Castle Hill, up in Cape Cod. And this is one of those touchstone places for me that I've since gone back to, and I look forward to going back there this summer. So I was preparing for this, ostensibly clay workshop. And a few months before that, I had started just absorbing these podcasts in the studio while I work, from the author Stephen Kotler. And it turns out he'd written several books, I think, about 10 years ago or so. They're all bestsellers, right? And Stealing Fire, I think, Chasing Superman. And so I'm absorbing these podcasts where he's the author interview, right? He's just downloading his whole, years of research in an hour while I'm working, right? So it's fantastic. And so I spent a period of time absorbing these podcasts and reconnecting with this idea of flow, which I recognized immediately. Oh yeah, that was the book on the shelf 20 years ago when I first started in clay that I was supposed to read. And I didn't. Literally, like I could see it over there. I could see how it came into my life. I could see just the word flow on the book. I could see somebody talking about it, and I didn't pick it up. It didn't come all the way in. It was just a seed. And instead, the next year, I'm finding clay for the first time as a college senior who was kind of sort of about to drop out because I didn't know what I was doing anymore. But instead, I found clay and just literally zoomed off, right? So here I am, almost 20 years later, light bulbs going off as I'm realizing, as I'm hearing the flow state described to me. And after a couple times, eventually I'm just like, literally just a light bulb went off. And it's like, and I had the experience of realizing, like, that song lyric of like, how did I get here? Like, this is not my beautiful studio, like, I mean, I'd before spent time literally wondering, how did I get here? How did I end up a 20-year path of clay? This was like left turn, and like here I am 20 years later. And it literally was that light bulb moment. It was like, this thing, this flow state thing, is why I was so hooked to clay when I found it. It explained all of it to me. And then I could literally see the path forward of like chasing this thing that I didn't even know I was chasing. Yeah. And so the realization that, like, for me, actually at that time in my life, I was able to go back and realize it could have been anything. There's no, I mean, at the time, I remember thinking, there's no particular reason it was even clay, right? It could have been anything. It could have been music. It could have been sports. For me, those were the touchstones for me. And then I randomly found clay, and again, not knowing it for so many years, but what it was the process for me, the process of learning to make the thing on the wheel, right? And the process, not any one element of the process. So how I first found it is kind of a long story, but once I sort of reconnected with it, I was on my way to this workshop, and it's just in the back of my mind, it's like, oh yeah, this seems important to me, right? So I go into that workshop and I write some things on the board, and I remember writing, "Why are we here?" which is the question that I start a workshop with, and I wrote flow, I think. And then I don't think I tried to write the author's name because that would have just been silly. And so I, go around the room and I say, "Does this mean anything to anybody?" And one gentleman raises his head up right away and says, "Mihai Csikszentmihalyi." And I looked at him and I thought, okay, yeah, yes, that's the guy's name. And can you please tell me more, right? And this gentleman was older. He was there with his two grown daughters. They were just passing a week on the Cape, right? He had never sat at a wheel before, I don't think. And he looked up and he said, "I'm a psychologist by profession, and that changed my life." He's like, 20 years ago, I took a workshop on flow, and it changed my life. It helped me turn around my burnout, and I now have a successful practice. I'm happy. And I thought, okay, I'm right. And then he also said, "Oh, I must have said something about, yeah, gee, this is an idea that has been floating around for me, and I've reconnected with it, and I think it's important. I don't really understand why." And I remember him also saying, "When the universe is stalking you, you have to pay attention." And I was like, okay. That filed that one away somewhere. And I still go back and teach at Castle Hill. I've been there once again since the pandemic, and I'm going back there this summer. I'm looking forward to it because to me it's a connection point. And also there's water nearby, and I can get in my kayak, and there's lots of beaches. So that's sort of how I first reconnected with it. And then, that was 2019. And then you back up in our story, it's like, okay, so then 2020 comes, right? The beginning of 2020, I just built a new wood kiln. I thought I was on this path towards something, whatever it was. And then literally the first firing of that new wood kiln was March of 2020. I fired it. And by the time I unloaded it, I was listening to the news, and I was like, I can't invite my friends back to unload this kiln because there's this weird virus that came, And so then then I'm onto that part of the story. And fortunately now I feel like, now I'm in a way, I guess I don't know if I've closed the chapter or I've opened another chapter, but I guess to sort of tie that up, if we can, these days I'm really able to connect a lot of dots, like we were talking about. When so much of your bandwidth is not consumed with anxiety and fight or flight, um, when you clear that away, all of a sudden, you can think a little more clearly. You can, and you can make connections. And I've been able to make a lot of connections just literally thinking back and realizing, looking back over my 20-year path of clay and being able to understand not just sort of the beginning point and the end point, but a lot more about how I got here and why, and a new perspective on where I want to go forward.
Well, there's some words that we keep using, and I'm realizing that people may or may not understand what they are. And we keep saying flow, 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 which people understand that in a common language. Like you'll even hear sportscasters. That was actually the first time I ever heard of flow was when Michael Jordan was playing. They used to describe him as being in the zone. And I was like, the zone, what is the zone? I want to be in the zone. And I, even as a 10-year-old kid, I could see that being in the zone, quote unquote, was a good thing. And the more that I have learned, what people were describing as being in the zone is this flow state that we're talking about. And Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is the psychologist that first kind of put it on paper as being, here are the tenets of this flow state. And there's a couple of the tenets that as potters we experience. One of the hallmarks is that when you're doing something that you're choosing to do, that you can be at a point of sustained focus, but you're focusing so much that you lose track of yourself, you become the activity. And then one of the other hallmarks is that you also lose track of time. And that's the part that I think a lot of potters will relate to, even if they don't know this psychology of flow, is that all of a sudden you're in the studio and you've forgotten to eat lunch. It's 4 hours later. You've finished these objects, but all you remember is coming and starting the process of working.
Yeah. So I have a lot to say on that. Did you know when I was a kid, before growing up, before I was in high school, I lived near Chicago, and it was around the time when Jordan and the Bulls were winning those championships. So I would watch the games at home on the television. My mom was a huge fan too. I can see her like jumping up and down for Jordan. That was kind of one of my first ways to understand it too, because you hear people talk about it and say I'm in the zone. I don't know if it was Csikszentmihalyi, but somebody used that classic example of Jordan, right? And like, there's actually a particular video I remember seeing where, well, there's a quote, I think, from Jordan himself, from Michael Jordan, where somebody says, you're so known for hitting that last second clutch shot, the crowd, everybody's watching you, clock's ticking. What are you thinking? And he looks at the interviewer and it's like, I'm not thinking anything. I'm in the zone. And you can see the video comes up and it's like slow motion, right? But he's not moving slow motion. Like everyone else is moving slow motion. The crowd is silent and he's just full speed and just, right? And it's like, he's not thinking. He's not thinking of failure. He's not thinking of the 10,000 people. He's not hearing them. He's not even thinking, he's not thinking about anything. He's right there, fully focused, fully absorbed in that moment. And so there's lots of different ways to describe that. It turns out there's the deep now. Some people call it a meditative state, right? Which is like, they're not the same, but they're related. But what's really fascinating is, so Csikszentmihalyi, he was a psychologist, a researcher, the head of the department, I think, at the University of Chicago. And in the 60s, 70s, 80s, he led the largest global study on basically interviewing people, right? And his sort of approach, I'm not an expert on this, but to summarize it, was basically, look at all these people who are so happy. How are they finding this happiness in their life? Let's find the source of this and let's interview them and talk to them, right? And this is the quick and dirty, but it's like, what he found was a lot of artists, athletes, musicians, creatives. All these people were engaged in activities that were becoming autotelic, which means that they were doing it as an end in itself, right? They're not doing it for any extrinsic reward. The process of doing their craft or their thing is the reward in itself. And as he talked about, as he interviewed these people over time, he developed that word flow, is where it comes from, is they were actually able to define it into a state of consciousness, right? So flow is called the flow state. And the flow comes from, you think of basically, I'm not here doing this thing, right? There's no me, there's no clay. I am one with the clay, right? Another real touch point is like for surfers is a real common place that people will find it. And they say, I'm out here floating in the ocean, or I'm on my board, I'm floating. All of a sudden, the next thing I know, there's nothing else, right? There's no board, there's no me, there's no ocean, right? I'm just out here and I'm sort of one with the ocean, right? So that's another real common place. But what's fascinating is it's actually universal. So through this huge global study, he was able to sort of boil it down into some characteristics. So then once you understand the characteristics of being in this state, you can look for them. Now you can measure them, right? So now you can actually, instead of just talking about some mythical thing of Michael Jordan being in the zone, or a musician, finding some amazing groove that they can't describe to you how they found it. Now it's a state of consciousness that you can define and measure. So he was not looking for flow. He was looking for the source of happiness, right? It sounds like a big thing to be looking for. But the third sort of conclusion of all this was that flow, this state, was fundamental to all of these people he was interviewing, who were these people experiencing this sort of elevated level of happiness in their life, right? It wasn't that these people were necessarily successful at what they were doing. It was that they were successful at reaching this state, this altered state of consciousness, while they were doing what they were doing. And sort of like you and I, and a lot of people, like, they may not have even known it, right? That's the interesting part. Because the truth is, like, another way to find it, another easy way to access it, is to think back to when you were a child. Like, there's some activity you were doing as a child when you were in this state, right? Riding a bike, digging in the dirt, acting on a stage, like whatever it was, like you entered this state where all these characteristics lit up one by one. It's like a stage of lights, and there's about 8 of them, which we can list, but once they all light up, it's not a mythical thing. It's actually you have reached this state.
In the beginning of pottery, there's this sense of love and infatuation with the process. But if you do it for 20 years, you might actually lose that. But then what you said is that I had to figure out how to restructure this so that I had it again. And I think that's the key here, is that new experience is also a part of the flow equation. There's this great graph that they talk about where there's this level of output of working in a pottery or doing whatever your job is, where if you do the same thing over and over and over again, you get bored. But if you change the variables, like firing or decorating, or you change your body of work, then you get into this sort of middle zone where things are new again, they're exciting again. But then above that, on the graph, there's this zone where things are so new that it's frustrating and you're pissed because you're like, none of this is making sense. And when I was looking into this, it reminded me of this word in education when I was an education student that they called the zone of proximal development. And that's where students are engaged in the process, but they don't get so frustrated that they quit. So I'm just kind of rambling now, but I'm thinking about how one of the things you told me in a separate conversation is that flow often finds us. And then once we realize it's happening, then we can start the process and initiate it and continue to, practice it in our lives, whatever it is.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot there. So first, before I forget, I want to throw you out 2 quotes. One is flow follows focus, and the other is pay attention to what you're paying attention to. Right. So the second one is one that I got from a respected clay person, right? Pay attention to what you're paying attention to. Find what you're drawn to, so that you can sort of source that back, right? And or follow that forward, right? And so that was in the back of my mind. But then I thought of this other one, flow follows focus. And that comes, I think, from Steven Kotler, because what he's basically saying is he's reminding you that you will not get into flow unless you get into focus, right? You have to have focus. So turn off the distractions, right? That's the biggest thing, is you need a certain amount of time to just hone in on this task at hand. But what I connected to is flow follows focus. So trace back what you're focusing on, right? Look at what you're paying attention to. Look at what brings you joy. Look at what makes you lose track of time. Find what part of the process it is that is doing that for you, and follow that. Either trace it back or follow it forward, and that will help you figure out, oh, look, this is where I'm finding it, right? Again, think about when you're a kid. What was the activity that you would, quote, lose yourself in, right? So recently, when I reconnected with exercise as a important thing in my life, I did running at first. I found myself saying, oh, wow, this is not so much about physical, this is about mental. And it still took a couple of years for me to realize, like, yeah, actually it is, right? But then later I was like, one year, actually during the same time period, I just bought a bike. It's like, I need to go for a bike ride, give my knees a rest. Well, it turns out as soon as I did that, I was like, this is more fun. And I just immediately connected. I was like, I used to do this as a kid. I rode my bike all over, until I was like, whatever, 16 or something. I was still riding my bike all around town, So I just, reconnected with that. And so now, like, literally, I've got a knee injury, but as soon as I hop back on my bike, it's like I'm getting into flow by riding my bike.
One of the things you and I have talked about is, could we teach a workshop in clay where we're setting up the scenario where the goal is for the student to experience flow and have some repetition of process so that they could take that home, so that they then could do that in their own studio? What would the workshop look like?
I've been brainstorming about this a bit, and I don't have the answer quite yet, but I'm working on it, and I'm gonna write it. And I see it with colleagues. I see bringing in other people, because it's not just me. I see it bringing in, hopefully, some light introductory yoga and meditation sessions. I do see some live music, because for me, music has always been part of it. But also, music just brings joyful. Music is just joyful, and assuming we can all agree on something to listen to, like, literally these days, as soon as I get in my car, put on my headphones, a couple of my favorite songs, and it's just like, I'm kind of instantly in that place. I'm kind of instantly in the happy place, So I think that music, but especially live music, would be amazing. It's got to be a beautiful setting, obviously. But, really, I guess, for me, I live here near the Penland School, so this has been a touchstone for me. I've assisted numerous classes there over the years, and I've taught there with my wife. So to me, my natural thought was just like, the workshops I've been there are so close to this already, right? You have this atmosphere of freedom, creativity. Everybody there is sort of ready to be on the same wavelength, right? Everything is just there. It's set up. The kilns are there. There's no restrictions. So the only thing you have to really do is turn on the flashlight, right? Make it be part of the syllabus so that everybody actually knows what we're talking about, so that we can know it when we see it. And then we literally write the characteristics, just start talking about it. That was just sort of the revelations that came. It's like, well, we need to talk about it. This is what we're doing. This is what we're looking for, and it's like, another fun thing is this, once you start talking about it, it's like, you're going to find it. Tomorrow you're going to hear about this, because I keep hearing about it everywhere I go, and every podcast that keeps coming up. It's not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. But as far as like how you actually do it, I'm still working on it. And I guess I'm sort of like, in a way, I'm looking forward. I know this is going to help bring some really cool projects together. I'm looking forward to working with other people and who can help turn this into a really amazing workshop. I don't actually think I know it's not clay specific, but for me, I'll probably, for the time being, I'll probably keep it related to a workshop where we can do, say, like a minimum of a week, but really 2 weeks, to where you can kind of get in there, get a sense of what's going on, have time, to make the pots, to do the thing that we do, and to hopefully fire a soda kiln together. Because to me, like, I can really tie that together. A wood kiln obviously is great too. But ultimately, I do see it like it's not clay specific at all. So I see it going in directions that don't have maybe, an on-site clay studio. Another just ironic thing for me is like, I remember a few weeks ago when you posted about you were looking for people to talk to for mental health awareness. And my immediate reaction in my head was like, oh, great. I wonder who he's going to talk to. And I forgot about it. And then you emailed me and said, hey, can we talk about flow from it? And it was just like another light bulb went off, It's just like, oh yeah, right. That's what I've been doing all this time. And that's pretty much what I'm going to be doing,
I think that's a good place to wrap up because it brings us full circle. And I want to encourage other people to check out. There's a couple books we've mentioned. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the original book. You can his name is very hard to spell. So if you just Google Flow, and then who is the Stephen
Kotler, Kotler. He's written numerous books. They're all bestsellers. I haven't read any of them. So what I would do personally, what I would recommend is you Google him, and what you'll find is, he's given several TED Talks, lots and lots of interviews. For every book he wrote, he would go on a long interview circuit. So just Google it, and you'll find your way there eventually. It's Csikszentmihalyi gave a couple TED Talks, but for me it was podcasts. Kotler talks really fast in his interviews and his talks. But if you listen to a couple of them in a row, like space it out over a few days, you'll actually realize like he's really laying it out for you. And there's a lot of evidence there. So I would say follow whichever path is interesting to you, and you'll find a lot of evidence. And let me know what you find.
And then the last plug is that Johan Hari podcast. It's on 10% Happier, and you can find that. That's available now on Dan Harris's podcast. So how can people get in touch with you if they wanted to talk more about this?
You can send me an email, williambakerpottery@gmail.com. I read all my emails, but I'm getting worse and worse at responding. So if I don't respond, then reach out on Instagram. It's just William Baker Pottery. Send me a message, and that usually gets my attention.
Well, sounds good, man. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. It's been wonderful.
I'd like to thank Will for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with him. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, that's Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Montana. They're sponsoring the whole series, More Than a Maker, and we appreciate their support. They've also been a great supporter of the Archie Bray Foundation, which is the parent nonprofit of the Brickyard Network, which this show is on. If you'd like to find out more about what Blue Cross and Blue Shield is doing for the citizens of Montana and their mental health, you can go to bigblueskyinitiativemt.com. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the #HonorNativeLand initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.